I'm making a video game with underwater mechanics. In this devlog, the game gets bigger. A new trap appears. The game can now be played from start to end. The game gets a progression and save system. At the end of the last devlog, I mentioned wanting to explore a mechanic where you can collect more than one treasure chest. Since the first version of the anchor only required the chest to be brought into the collider zone to end the game, I reworked the anchor to work as the entry and exit point. First task was to make the anchor support holding multiple chests. Since the player already has this mechanism, I based the anchor's new behavior off of that. I created an object called an item port, which is essentially a transform with a gizmo and can take or drop an item. It then becomes the parent of the held item. I wanted to reuse the code for the item port and remove the specialized player item port, so I give the item port the ability to drop. I set up a quick script that would call hold and drop on an item port whenever a treasure chest entered the collider, which created this neat portal-like infinite loop. Once I had the item port, I created some art for the different chests. I wanted to distinguish by grade type, bronze, silver, gold, so I created some hooks with those color tones. I designed the hooks so that they can convey a few things. 1. There's 3 items in the level you can grab. 2. The chest's attached to the hook, so you have to bring the chest back to the anchor in order to retrieve a chest. 3. There's 1 item in the level that will match the color of a hook. Once I had those working, I then tried to rework the chests to give them more indication that they were of a material. Here's a second attempt. I then showed my spouse who's been giving you pointers and encouragement, and she tried giving a sprite a shot. After a 30-second breakdown of the tools, she first played with making the material more obvious. I left to get a glass of water while she played around with a sprite some more. When I came back, this is what she had come up with, which just looks fantastic. With the chests out of the way, I then proceeded to give these chests a new home and make the level bigger. Making the level bigger began by finding the best places to make a cut into the current level to expand it. Since I wanted to play with the concept of depth and water color for a zone, I decided to split off a section from the bright side and the lighter water shade. I wanted the length of each section to be consistent and originally made the area 3 or 4 large units wide, or about 30 to 40 units in Unity. This felt really empty, so I decided to shrink the section on the right a bit. The original version of the level had a puzzle section I liked at the far right, so I tried to recreate that shape and then fill some of the areas around. The original level had a lot of noise in the middle, so I decided to try to reduce that with this section of the level. There was a gap in the floor in the middle area, so I created another vertical drop section here. For the layout, I recall seeing a diagram of a tomb layout with a diagonal corridor and a small chamber. That structure seemed pretty cool to me, so I based part of the chamber off of this. From the original chamber, there's a section of the level that is pretty fun to try to navigate quickly, this diagonal hall. I wanted to duplicate that area, but make it symmetrical, so there's an incline you swim up through and then descend from, going both ways. Once I had the block out, then came the first pass at filling it in with my tiles and the ground collider tile map. While filling out the block out, I made the realization that my new zones used blocks with 1 tile of thickness for the terrain, but my current tile set only had a transition between segments that are 2 tiles in length. I tried making a tile set that would be 1 tile in length, and that had the same colors. While making that, I realized that I also would need a corner tile that was 1 tile thick, so I made a tile that could blend with this specific corner. When I got to filling out the right side block out, I also had sections that were a single block thick, which wasn't that much of a problem now that I had 1 thick tiles. However, when I got to this corner, I realized that the blended tile went left. That would need a single block blend into a non-single block corner tile blending to the right. So I took the lazy route and just reworked that section to require 2 tile thick walls. With the new sections now being tiled up, it was time to move on to filling those sections out. I received a suggestion via Discord to make the level feel more varied by adding stalactites and stalagmites. Functionally, these work the same as the mine. There's an on-trigger collider, and they do a certain damage when the player enters the collider box. I wasn't very happy with the first or second version of the stalactites. While the second version has a bit more color, they still did not look good against the tile. I also attempted a version where the edge of the stalactite was blended to look like it came from the center of the tile, but that also did not look good. Since I wasn't happy with it, I stopped working on that part and moved on to something else. That night I looked around for some reference and inspiration and realized that some games have their spikes placed behind the tile. I then saw a screenshot of another platformer with a cave setup and the rock formations are placed behind the level tile. After swapping the layers, I was a bit happier with how that looked. I asked my spouse for a second opinion and she suggested that I add some shading, making 2 layers of stalactites with a darker shade in the background. Here's what an early version of them looked like in-game. Since there were pieces where a single 1-tile-high stalactite-stalagmite combination didn't work, I ended up making a medium-height stalactite-stalagmite combination. I originally had box colliders in the stalactites, even the end pieces. I decided to instead use polygon colliders in a custom physics shape with a polygon shape, so the edges felt fair. This way you're not dealt damage from something that clearly looks invisible to you. Once the clusters of stalactites looked nice, I replaced a lot of the pixel mines with stalactite-stalagmite clusters. I made a decision to change any of the ceiling mines that had no chains to versions with chains, sort of like the chain broke off and the mine floated to the top. This would make the level feel more varied since there would be more moving chains. In the future, I may add some randomness to when the chain animation plays. Once the mines and stalactites and stalagmites were placed, I did some organization and clustered the mines based on what zone they were part of just to keep my sanity. With a new chest and new level size, I wanted to give some more impact to the level transition by showing the player their score. My original idea was to have a screen with the 3 chests arranged and they would fade in if you had collected them. Something like this which I tried by just changing the values in the editor to see how it looked. I knew that I needed an eye enumerator to animate the transition of the alpha value of a particular image. The tricky part was getting all 3 to work sequentially. My original code ran all 3 of them at once since I started a new coroutine instead of returning the eye enumerator for each type. After some googling, I found that I could use multiple eye enumerators, one for each switch case instead of having to return a list of eye enumerator based off of an answer on Stack Exchange. This is what the end level scene for a level would look like. I want to have a different collectible type for each level, but use the same level end scene with each collected item fading in. I then looked into creating an intro cutscene. My spouse had suggested the idea of lowering the anchor with the diver like Mary Poppins flying down with her umbrella. I took this idea and instead made the diver sort of stand on the anchor as the anchor is dropped, and then jump off. This felt more doable with my current animation skills. This gave me a taste of using the Unity timeline. I created a new scene off of the first level and copied the terrain asset, deleting what I didn't need. I did this to avoid the cutscene on restart since it would happen in a different scene. But I think I can either support skipping the cutscene or figure out how to track that the cutscene has been played once when reloading the level. With a cutscene and an end scene, I tried building the game for the first time and exported it to an empty directory. I then had my spouse give it a shot and took notes of what she did and got some feedback from her. The 2 big points were: 1. How was I supposed to know what the controls were? And 2. It feels like you fall too fast. Even though I had a control screen in the main menu, I realized there could be a quick tutorial to force the player to learn the mechanics and learn how to interact with bringing items to the anchor and exiting a level when it was complete. I started the tutorial by creating a small sketch on graph paper. For the tutorial level, I wanted enough room to make the player swim up, sprint, fall down, learn the fall speed, grab an item, and bring an item to the anchor. Just like the first level, I created a tile set for the tutorial. I kept it limited to a 2-tile length transition. Since I didn't need much in the way of tiling a building diagonally, I tried making a pattern that would look like a steel beam or steel structure. For the tooltips, I used part of the UI canvas to have different text objects show up after certain actions had been made. Only one is active at a time, and there's an enumeration that acts like a state machine. The script references them in a list and moves down the list as a hint is completed. The enumeration simply holds the index of the item to show. Most of it worked easily, but I ran into a race condition when computing if an item was being held. What's happening here is that the update method checks if the player is holding an item, and if the player pressed the Q key. However, since the Q key drops the item from the player's pickup script, the condition isn't true at the same time. You can't press Q and check if you're holding an item at the same instance since the item is dropped on key down for the Q key. So I solved this by having a small timer that keeps track of if you had an item or not and stores the result in an internal boolean. So, if you were carrying an item within the last second and pressed E or Q, that counts as the success condition for that tooltip. I then added a set of small spikes to teach the player about being able to take damage and what that damage does to you. To give more direction, I made an arrow which I wanted to place in the background. My spouse gave me the idea to make the arrows animate and make them move. I ended up accomplishing this with a lean-tween library, using a simple lean-tween.move and resetting the arrow's position to the starting position on completion. Here's what that looks like. While doing the tutorial, I realized I missed a couple of keys from the control screen. So I took this opportunity to also rework the UI since I wanted to use a grid layout, but it hadn't worked. Thanks to this video from GameDev Guide, I was able to make my UI less crooked and more structured. Here's a comparison between the controls without the layout and the controls with the layout. I also cleaned up the rest of the UIs. Main menu, settings screen, pause menu, restart menu. I still need to do some work on the pause and restart UI since the buttons are stretching to fill out the container. So the container may need to be smaller, or I may need to have more padding on all sides to squish that text. With a tutorial in place, I wanted to track whether the player had completed it or not. Since my goal is to have multiple levels, I don't want to force the player to have to play through all of them in one sitting, so some sort of save system is needed to at least track that the player has completed the tutorial. I also wanted to save the score for each level, which is currently what items from a level you gathered in one attempt. I did some searching on YouTube and ended up referencing this video by GameDev Guide on how to create a save and load system. My save data is just a dictionary of a level name and a set of treasure types that you've collected for that level. I tested the save system by making a scene with buttons that calls a save method on the save manager and buttons to create, save, and load. The load button also prints the saved state. With a save system done, I moved on to designing a placeholder UI for selecting levels. I've been playing Pokemon Snap recently, so the idea of having a map and being able to replay a level to improve your score is something I also want to have. Except I think my map will end up looking more like the Mario World map. For the level selection system, I based the original version off of this video by Lost Relic Games. The initial version only needs a button to select a level and an area to display the progress for a level. When a level completes, the treasure types gathered are saved. When the level selection screen loads, it loads the save and changes the alpha value of the images from 0 to 255 if you gathered that treasure, similar to what the level end screen does. The last thing I worked on was a suggestion I received multiple times regarding the fall speed being too fast. I wanted to have a sort of Flappy Bird mechanic where you have to control the fall. I quickly tested having a fixed velocity when falling instead of letting the physics system apply, and it already feels much nicer. I think this will make the leaps of faith obstacle parts feel more fair, since at the moment you sort of have to try to control your descent blindly since the physics-based velocity gives you very little room to react. That's it for this devlog. My focus for the next part will be playing more with a fall speed and integrating a benefit of using the overdrive mechanic to fall slower. Create a cutscene for the tutorial with the player jumping into a water tank instead of just appearing at the start. Add some sound effects. I already have placeholder music and audio channels set up. I purchased a humble bundle that included a 10,000 sound effect pack, and it includes underwater sounds. So hopefully I can find a good bubble sound. Until next time. Here's a recording of running through the tutorial level select screen and acquiring a chest from the first level so you can get a feel for the game pace.